This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears. It is not a metaphor. It was a real trail, and those were real tears. In the early 19th century, the United States was expanding. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had doubled the size of the country. Settlers, driven by hunger for land and resources, looked west with relentless determination. But that land was already home to native nations, people who had lived there for centuries, long before the first European ever set foot on the continent. Among them were the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These 5 tribes, later called the 5 Civilized Tribes by white Americans, had adapted many aspects of European American culture. They had written constitutions, centralized governments, farming economies, Christian churches, and even newspapers. The Cherokee published the Cherokee Phoenix in both English and the Cherokee syllabary. But their willingness to assimilate did not protect them. Their very existence was seen as an obstacle to American progress. White settlers wanted more land, especially for cotton farming, and the native peoples occupied some of the most fertile territory in the southeastern United States. In 1828, gold was discovered in Cherokee land in Georgia, adding fuel to the growing pressure for removal. State governments, particularly Georgia, passed laws to undermine native sovereignty, encouraging land grabs and outlawing tribal governance. Native resistance was mounting, but so was the force against them. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. Jackson had made his intentions clear during his campaign. A veteran of wars against native peoples, he viewed their removal as a national priority. The Indian Removal Act gave the federal government the power to negotiate treaties that would require native tribes to exchange their lands in the east for new territory west of the Mississippi River. The law claimed the removals would be voluntary. In practice, they were anything but. Treaties were often signed under coercion or fraud. When persuasion failed, the government used military force. The Cherokee Nation resisted removal through legal means. They declared their sovereignty and took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, the court ruled in their favor, stating that the laws of Georgia had no force within Cherokee lands. Chief Justice John Marshall affirmed that native nations were distinct political communities. But President Jackson allegedly dismissed the decision, saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let him enforce it." Though that quote may be apocryphal, Jackson's actions spoke louder. He ignored the ruling and continued to push for removal. In 1835, a small faction within the Cherokee Nation, unrepresentative of the people, signed the Treaty of New Echota. This treaty ceded all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for money and land in what is now Oklahoma. The treaty was never approved by the Cherokee government or the majority of its people. Yet, in 1836, the U.S. Senate ratified it by a single vote. The treaty became the official legal basis for removal. By 1838, the government moved to enforce the treaty. Under orders from President Martin Van Buren, the U.S. Army, led by General Winfield Scott, began the forced removal of the Cherokee. Soldiers entered homes, often without warning. Families were torn apart. People were herded into makeshift prison camps, overcrowded, unsanitary, with little food or clean water. From these camps, the Cherokee were marched westward in groups. The journey was nearly 1,200 miles long, through rough terrain, rivers, and forests. Most of it was traveled on foot. Some moved by wagon or boat, but the majority walked. The path would come to be known as the Trail of Tears. Around 16,000 Cherokee were forced to migrate. It's estimated that between 4,000 and 6,000 died from disease, exposure, and starvation. Cholera, dysentery, and whooping cough spread quickly in the camps and on the road. Many died in freezing conditions during the winter of 1838 to 1839. Elders, infants, and the sick were particularly vulnerable. Survivors buried their dead along the trail, often in unmarked graves. The Cherokee were not the only tribe to suffer this fate. The Choctaw were the first to be removed after the Indian Removal Act. In 1831, thousands were forced to leave their homeland in Mississippi. A Choctaw chief described the journey as a trail of tears and death. The Creek were removed in 1836, followed by the Chickasaw in 1837. Each removal followed a similar pattern: broken promises, forced marches, and widespread death. The Seminole resisted more fiercely than any other tribe. In Florida, they fought a series of brutal conflicts known as the Seminole Wars. The Second Seminole War, from 1835 to 1842, was especially bloody. The U.S. Army, facing guerrilla resistance in the swamps, struggled to subdue the Seminole. Thousands died on both sides. Many Seminole were captured and removed, but some escaped into the Everglades, where their descendants live to this day, among the few native peoples who never signed a removal treaty. By the early 1840s, most native nations east of the Mississippi had been removed. The government had claimed millions of acres of tribal land. White settlers rushed in to plant cotton and build plantations. The economy of the South boomed on the backs of displaced native peoples and enslaved Africans. The impact of the Trail of Tears and the broader Indian removal policy was catastrophic. Tribes lost more than land. They lost sacred sites, homes, social structures, and a sense of place. Entire generations were devastated. The psychological trauma of loss, betrayal, and violence passed from parent to child, a legacy of pain that endures to this day. But native communities were not erased. In Indian Territory, tribes began to rebuild. The Cherokee re-established their government, schools, and legal systems. The Choctaw and Chickasaw did the same. They created new towns and maintained cultural traditions. Language, religion, and community ties survived, though forever changed. In the decades that followed, native peoples faced further violence and systemic marginalization. The U.S. government continued to break treaties. Native lands were further reduced through policies like the Dawes Act of 1887, which promoted allotment and privatization of tribal lands. Boarding schools forced native children to abandon their languages and cultures. And for generations, Native Americans were denied the right to vote, denied full citizenship, denied basic recognition. Despite this, Native nations survived. In the 20th and 21st centuries, tribes across the country fought for and won legal recognition, land reclamation, and cultural revitalization. Activists brought national attention to historical injustices and demanded accountability. The American Indian Movement, formed in the 1960s, protested federal policies and helped shift public awareness. Native authors, artists, and educators have worked to reclaim their stories, preserve traditions, and teach the next generation. Today, the legacy of the Trail of Tears is remembered through memorials, museums, and the voices of native descendants. Trails have been marked across multiple states, retracing the routes taken during removal. Schools teach the story. Elders tell it to the young. It is not just history. It is lived memory. The Trail of Tears was not a single event, but a pattern of betrayal and force that echoed throughout US history. It set a precedent for how the government would deal with native nations for more than a century, through displacement, assimilation, and broken treaties. And yet, native peoples endure. They resist, they thrive, and they remember. The Trail of Tears is a story of profound suffering, but also of survival. It is a story America must continue to reckon with, honestly and fully. This was not just a chapter in a history book. It was a turning point in the lives of tens of thousands. A trail walked in pain and remembered in pride. If this story moved you, honor the truth. Like, subscribe, and share. Let's make sure history isn't forgotten.